Hello, I'm Tyson Conde. I'm from UC Berkeley. I should mention I'm still a student, but I won't be for long. I just signed on to Yahoo Research for August, but I'm here to present MapReduce Online. My co-authors, Neil Conway, Peter Alvaro, my advisor, Professor Joe Hillerstein, all at UC Berkeley, and my colleagues at Yahoo Research, Khaled and Russell Sears. Okay, so the MapReduce programming model, you're probably all familiar with it. It allows programmers to think in a data-centric fashion by, being able to apply a two-step transformation to sets of data sets, or records. In the map step, we have a map function that takes in a key value pair and returns a list of new key value pairs. The system will apply this map function to input records. It will divide the output records into groups. Now the reduce step has a reduce function which takes a key and a corresponding list of values, so the key is the group, and returns a new list of values. And the system will consolidate the groups from the map step and apply the reduce function to each group. The MapReduce system model is a shared nothing architecture, which is tuned for massive data parallelism. Which means that what we're going to have is we're going to have many maps operating on portions of the input. These portions are called blocks. We're going to have many reducers, each of which are assigned specific groups. And the target here is batch-oriented computations over huge data sets. And runtimes range in minutes to hours, as you all know, and we usually execute these things on tens to thousands of machines. So failures are very common. So fault tolerance is actually very crucial. And the fault tolerance model in Hadoop is quite elegant. It simply says when an operator dies, just simply restart it. We can do this because operators complete before producing any output. And there's an atomic data exchange protocol in between operators. Simple, elegant, easy to remember. So MapReduce, as many of you know here, is often applied to streams of data that are arriving continuously. So analytics over click streams, network traffic, and web crawl data. Now the batch approach, which is to buffer, load, and process, is actually a poor fit. It results in very high latency and quite frankly is not scalable. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to move to a more online approach where we're running MapReduce jobs continuously and analyzing data as it arrives. And there's two domains of interest here. The first domain is online aggregation, which allows for a more interactive data analysis experience, where you can watch the answer evolve over time, rather than just see its progress. And the second domain is stream processing, where you're continuously processing data streams in real time. And like I said before, blocking operators are a poor fit because they only give you final answers, which by definition means you can't apply these things to infinite streams. So operators need to pipeline, but we must retain the fault tolerance model, not only for correctness, but we have to keep it simple because failures are very common. So at Berkeley, we implemented a pipeline version of MapReduce. Maps are able to operate on infinite data, allowing for stream processing, and reduces can export early answers, enabling online aggregation. And we build it in Hadoop, and we're calling it the Hadoop Online Prototype, or HOP. It's Hadoop, it looks like Hadoop on the outside, but underneath, it pipelines. So we preserve the interface and all the APIs, and we define a new pipeline fault tolerance model, which I'll describe here in this talk. So here's the rest of the talk. I'll give just a brief background on Hadoop, and I'll focus on the plumbing of Hadoop, because that's where all the changes occur. I'll then talk about the changes, specific changes in HOP that we enabled for online aggregation and stream processing to work. I'll then provide a brief overview, or just a comparison of blocking versus pipelining. Now the performance here is not a thorough performance study. But what I want to do is I want to focus in on the characteristics of blocking versus pipelining. So there are cases when blocking is actually better than pipeline, and vice versa. And then I'll go into some future work that will plan to do. So Hadoop, the architecture is made up of two components. There's the MapReduce component, and there's the distributed file system component. In the MapReduce component, we have a single master node, the job tracker. We have many worker nodes, called task trackers. Clients submit jobs to the job tracker. The job tracker takes those jobs and splits it into MapReduce tasks, and then assigns those tasks on demand. The Hadoop distributed file system has a similar look to it. There's a single name node, which keeps track of all the metadata in the file system, and a number of data nodes, which hold the actual data. Now, data is stored in fixed size blocks, usually 64 megabytes, and it usually holds the input to the map task and the output to the reduce task. So here's a little example cluster. I have a single master or job tracker at the top, and I have 4 worker nodes. And I have a client here submitting a job to the job tracker. The job tracker will schedule those map and reduce tasks. I've shown 2 maps and 2 reduces here. And the maps will read their input blocks from HDFS. And they will produce their output. Now their output is going to be sorted on first by group ID and then by key. And group ID is determined by taking the hash of the key, that key portion of the map output, and modding it by the number of reduces. We're going to store that output, sir? Of course. I'm only talking default here. Yeah, there's a lot of other ways. So we're going to store that output on HDFS. Now I've color-coded the output for each reduce. Now within each color, you're going to be sorted on key. That's important. So then we're going to say the maps are going to tell the job tracker that it's finished. And the job tracker is going to eventually tell the reducers where those map locations are. And the reducers are going to issue an HTTP GET for their portion of the output. The output is going to be transferred over to the other side. Now, as I mentioned before, the reduce input, these are sorted runs that are assigned the same group ID. So all the reduce function needs to do is merge these sorted runs before it actually applies the reduce function to each group. And then finally writes its final output to HDFS. So HOP, or the Hadoop Online Prototype, is simply pipelining between operators. So data is actually pushed from producers to consumers. Now for the purposes of this talk, when I say producers, you want to think of maps. When I say consumers, you want to think of reducers. But we also, in the paper, we describe inter-job pipelining, where the producers are actually reduces from some job, and the consumers are a map from a subsequent job. But I won't talk about that today. So producers are actually scheduling the data transfer concurrently with the operator computation. And notably, consumers also have to notify the producers early on. You can't wait for the map to finish before the producers actually notify where they want the data to go. So the HOP API is pretty much the same as Hadoop, so no changes are required to existing clients. So Pig, Hive, Jackal, they all still work. We did add a couple of parameters. We added a parameter that will, tell whether or not you want pipeline or blocking modes. The default is blocking. And a job tracker now accepts a series of jobs. So we can schedule those jobs concurrently if they're pipelining between each other. So here's the Hadoop, or the HOP pipeline execution. We're going to schedule the map and reduce task, but we're also going to forward the map locations early on to the reduces. Those reduces can actually make requests over to the maps early. And then from there, the maps can start pipelining the data to the reduces. So what are we pipelining? Well, early on, our initial design, we actually just started pipelining a record at a time. So we eagerly pipeline. And this is bad for a number of reasons. I have 3 here. The first reason is it prevents map-side pre-aggregation, also known as the combiner. The second reason is it actually moves all of the sorting work from the map side to the reduce side. And the third reason is that the map computation can actually block on the network I/O. So instead what we do, in our revised design, we actually pipeline small sorted runs, or what is called spill files. We have 3 threads. Now, we didn't create these threads. These threads actually already existed in Hadoop. The task thread actually applies the map or reduce function and takes that output and puts it in main memory buffer. The spill thread sorts and combines the buffer and then spills to a file. And then we added some code inside the job tracker that's going to take these spill files and push them over to the reduces. And we also added to the spill thread a simple adaptive algorithm where we're going to halt the pipeline when we get spill files backing up, meaning that the consumers are not able to keep up with the producers, or if we have an effective combiner. And we're going to resume the pipeline by first merging and combining the accumulated spill files into a single file. So you see what we're doing is we're taking some of that sorting work and we're pushing it back to the map because the reduces are not able to keep up, say, with the rate of production. So our fault tolerance, our pipeline fault tolerance model, or PFT, we have 2 versions. The version in the paper is what I'm calling simple PFT design. In that design, a reduce is going to treat the in-progress map output as tenured. Okay, so if a map dies, then we're going to throw that output away. If a map succeeds, then we're going to accept it. In a revised design, we're going to add, or we're going to basically enforce a deterministic boundary on spill files. And we're going to assign spill files a monotonically increasing sequence number. Now, for correctness, the reduce task is going to ensure that the spill files are applied in an idempotent fashion. Meaning you don't want to apply the same spill file more than once. And as an optimization, map tasks are going to avoid sending redundant spill files. So for speculation, when the speculative task comes up, it's going to check with its reducer on the other side and make sure it doesn't need to send this spill file before sending.
Is that with a checkpoint?
There is a checkpoint mechanism that I'm not mentioning here with the job tracker, but also when there's a communication protocol there where the map is going to ask the reduce, what have you seen so far? And since the spill file IDs are monotonically increasing, the reduce can send back, I've seen up to spill file N.
So you don't support non-deterministic maps?
No. So the buffer size needs to be fixed. That's a very important point here.
No, it's worse. I mean, my question is more about...
Oh, non-determined?
Like where you're fetching web pages. It's non-deterministic. If you rerun, you'll get a different order of keys and values.
Right. We assume the map function is deterministic.
Okay.
Do you also assume that the input to the map is fully checkpointed or checkpointable?
I don't think that's an issue with us, but maybe, do you have something particular in mind?
Well,
so the input to a
it seems
map.
to me as though if one mapper crashes, you then have to restart that map task.
That's right. And
You
if
said that you support infinite streams, and my HDFS is not that big.
so, this pipeline fault tolerance model is specific to just regular batch mode. I should make that clear. There's another fault tolerance model specific to stream processing.
Got it.
And I'm not going to mention that today, but we can talk more about that offline. Thank you for clarifying. So some benefits of pipelining. Well, for one, we're able to perform online aggregation, which allows for an early view of the result while the computation is running, which adds a sort of a more interactive data analysis experience, where you as the user say when you want to stop. It also enables stream processing, where tasks can operate on infinite data streams, enabling sort of real-time data analysis. Performance, well, not always. Pipelining can improve CPU and I/O overlap. It can also steady the network traffic, because, and what I mean by that, we'll get fewer load spikes. I'll show an example later. And it can improve the cluster utilization, because we can have reduces start pre-sorting early. So let me go into online aggregation. I'll give you a brief look at the implementation, and I'll show you an example approximation query. So for the implementation, all we're going to do is we're going to execute the reduce task on the intermediate data that we've received so far, and then publish that result to HDFS. So the maps are going to read their input from HDFS just like they did before. When the pipelining starts, as soon as it gets data on the other side, we're going to just simply run the reduce function and export that result to HDFS. So here's an example query. So the data that we use is the Wikipedia's traffic statistics. It's about 1 terabyte. And what it contains is it contains web page clicks on a per hour basis from users. And it consists of about 5,066 compressed files. Each file contains 1 hour's worth of click logs. And the query we want to run is we want to group by language and hour and count the number of clicks that occurred in that language hour session. And the approximation that we want to compute is we're going to assume that we're going to approximate the final answer by taking that intermediate click count and scaling it up using 2 metrics. The first metric is the job progress. The job progress says how much of the input data have we processed so far. It's proportional to that, I should say. The second metric is what I'm calling sample fraction. And that is going to be the total number of hours divided by the number of hours we've sampled up to that point. How do I get these values? Well, the total number of hours is right here. We know that a priori. Each file contains 1 hour of click logs, and we know how many files we have. So we can compute that up front. For the number of hours sampled, I'm going to add a fraction of an hour to the count portion of this query. Which, what I'm saying is that if I add a click, I'm going to also add a fraction that says how much of this record is, does this correspond to the total hour. So if you have 4 records in an hour, one record is 1/4. Okay, and that's going to get summed up with the clicks. And here's the answer. So what I'm showing is I'm showing three plots here, color-coded. The black bar is actually the final answer, which comes 2 hours later. The red and the blue bar comes within 2 minutes. The red bar is the approximation based on the sample fraction, and the blue bar is the approximation based on the job progress. As you can see, just eyeballing it, the sample fraction is a lot better. Okay? Even though the distribution is about the same for all cases. This bar graph, by the way, is just for a single hour. And the reason why the job progress is so bad is explained right here. What I'm plotting here, on the x-axis I'm plotting time, so the job takes about 2 hours here. On the y-axis I'm plotting the standard error. What is the standard error? Well, it's approximation error is also what it's known for. It's the estimate minus the actual absolute value divided by the actual. So how far are we off from the actual? So a 1 means that we're off twice as much. So that's pretty bad. Now the problem with the job progress is that it assumes the hours are uniformly sampled. Okay, so we've sampled, say, 10% of the input data, but what 10%, what does that correspond to in an hour? We could have sampled much more of 1 hour and much less of another hour. The sample fraction actually figures that distribution out. Now, the job progress would have actually worked if we had a better sampling algorithm of the input. But we didn't implement that yet. That's a piece of future work. So we're sort of punting to the user to actually take care of that right now.
Does progress, do you use how much of the file has been read?
We use how much of the input, how far along the maps were.
The problem with that, of course, is that there's enough buffering in the sort and the shuffle that you're going to get overestimates of how much you processed, because it's just how much you've read.
Yeah, I agree that there's definitely a lot of problems with using that as an approximation value, which is why we were forced to go back and add this extra approximation scale up. So yeah, it's future work to figure out the right way to do it. So stream processing, I'll talk about the implementation, I'll give you a use case. Now this is just one use case. There are a number of other use cases that Yahoo is currently, or not, someone, I gotta be careful, is currently looking at or thinking about. So implementation, okay, so map and reduce tasks run continuously. The challenge is what if the number of tasks exceed the slot capacity? Right now, what we do in that case is we just wait for the right slot capacity to free up. So we'll hold the job back and then run. Map tasks stream spill files. The input can be taken from an arbitrary source, so another MapReduce job, say, or socket, whatever. And the system will handle the garbage collection for you. So you don't want these spill files to get back up and exhaust your disk. And window management is done by the reducer. So for this case, we actually had to extend the reduce function interface. So before, the reduce function interface took the input data in the form of a record, which I showed you. It also took an output collector, which allows the reduce function to send that list of values to the output. We added an input collector as well. Now what the input collector is for, right. Let me explain what it's for. Let's say you want a window of 5 records. Now for the reduce harness, I don't know what the window is, okay, that the reduce function is trying to implement. So I'm just going to give you, if I got 6 records, I'm going to give you 6 records. Now if you want a window of 5 records, you'll take those 5 records, you send it to the output collector. What do you do with that 6th record? Well, you need to have it called for the next window. So that's what the input collector is for. Is this the best solution? Well, that's up for debate. This is the solution that we implement. The return value, we added return value. It says when to call the reduce function next. Do we call it in X number of milliseconds, or do we call it after receiving some number of records? Okay, so using this continuous query framework, we actually implemented a real-time monitoring system. So what we're trying to build here is we're trying to build a monitoring system that uses MapReduce to monitor itself. So a continuous job that monitors the cluster health. It uses the same scheduler for user jobs and monitoring jobs. So we get this economy of mechanism, where Chakwa is another monitoring system. That's this separate component. What we want is we want to reuse Hadoop to implement a monitoring system, rather than have this separate piece of code that needs to be maintained, et cetera, et cetera. We have what are called agents that monitor machines. What they do is they record statistics of interest, say from /proc or the task log files, et cetera. And these are implemented as continuous map tasks. We then have aggregates that group these map local statistics. And they can group on a number of different levels. You can have, say, a reducer per rack that sort of groups things, all the machine statistics on a rack, and gives you a rack view of the load. Or you can have a reduce that deals with a data center view of the load. And we have reduce windows of 1, 5, and 15-second load averages here, just for this implementation. And the implementation, or the query that we wrote, actually monitors VMstat for swapping. So VMstat tells you how much swapping is occurring on the local disk. An alert is triggered in our code after it reaches some threshold. And here I'm showing that threshold being reached with the vertical bar. And although you can't tell by this graph, that vertical bar is actually triggered after about 1 second after the threshold has been passed, which is well below the duty cycle of task tracker to job tracker, which I believe is 5 seconds. So what we are thinking about in the future is feeding this information back into the scheduler so the scheduler can make better decisions about future scheduling tasks. So a question.
Yes. Haven't you mentioned earlier that your map tasks have to be deterministic in order to fault-tolerant model works?
So no, it's independent of the fault. Well,
Because these tasks
so-
are definitely not deterministic.
sorry.
These tasks we should show before, like reading process.
Yeah, so again, the streaming version, we have a different fault tolerance model, and I'm not going to talk about, I can talk about that offline, but the fault tolerance model I described before
is with respect to batch-oriented computations, the kind of computations that Hadoop performs today. For a streaming fault, we can talk more about the streaming fault tolerance model after the talk. Okay, so I'm just going to give a brief performance study. This is by far not a thorough performance study, but there are some obvious cases that exist. So like I mentioned, this is still an open problem. A lot of performance-related work still remains. We're going to focus on the obvious cases. Why block? Well, if you have an effective combiner, or if the reduce step is a bottleneck. Those are two reasons. And not the only two reasons, but those are the two main reasons that we've seen. Why pipeline? To improve cluster utilization and to smooth out the network traffic. So here I'm showing just a toy job, okay, just to show you, sort of zoom in, if you will, on the characteristics of pipelining and blocking. It's a word count on using 2 small EC2 nodes. I've dedicated one machine to run maps only and one machine to run reduces. I've given them 2 slots each. The input data is 2 gigabytes and the block size is 512 megabytes. So the job contains 4 maps and I've hard-coded it to 2 reduces. Now the plots here, I'm showing on the left, I'm showing the blocking plot, on the right I'm showing pipelining. The y-axis is the progress of the job, and the x-axis is the time, how long it takes. So the progress is that little percentage indicator that you would see on the Hadoop interface. I'm just plotting that out over time. So let's take a look at a few points. Here at this point, we have 2 maps finished. And what they're doing is they're sorting and they're sending their outputs to the reduces. There's a 3rd map finishing, sorting, and sending its output to the reduce. And here's the final map, finishing and sending its output to the reduce. Now here's an idle period on the reduce side of about 6.5 minutes. Here's where the first map output was received, second map output, 3rd, and the 4th. Now over here on the pipelining case, we don't see any significant idle periods during the shuffle phase, meaning that the reduces on in the pipelining case are constantly receiving data, constantly making progress on the shuffle phase. And what pipelining will do, though, is it will push more sorting work to the reduce side. We see that with this little plateau here at 75%. Now, we've modified our version of HOP to have the shuffle phase be 75% of progress. I should mention that. So at this point, at 75% of the progress, the reducers have received all the data and they're doing their final sort before they're running the reduce function. We get a little plateau there because the reducers are performing extra sorting work. Total run times for blocking 15 minutes and for pipelining. So recall in blocking that operators block. So this can lead, I should say, to poor CPU I/O overlap and reduced task idle periods. So we made use of the Amazon CloudWatch feature to actually monitor that previous job that I showed you on the previous slide. On the top portion here, I'm showing the map CPU. On the bottom portion, I'm showing the reduce CPU. This is why I separated the 2 machines. Okay.
Does the chart look similar if you didn't separate them? If you're at more like a normal cluster?
Well, as far as the Amazon CloudWatch, it's sort of a what is going on in the entire machine. It's not what's going on in an individual process. So I would have got the sum of both CPU.
Right, but what would have happened to the runtime? Because effectively
I have a job.
The static one, right?
Sorry.
Because you
Yeah.
couple the one where the reduce can't do anything until the map's finished.
Right. So in my next 2 performance slides, I will have a more realistic example for sure. Here I'm just showing, zooming in on the characteristics in isolation. Yeah. Okay, so this first little bump in the graph, you might not be able to make it out, but it's a little bump. This is where I'm loading the data, so ignore it. This vertical line, the first one is where the blocking job starts, the second one is where the pipelining job starts. Here we see that reduce idle period, 6.5 minutes in the CPU side on the reduce. And here, where the pipelining starts, we also see the CPU starting almost immediately. So also only final answers are fetched. So more data is fetched at once, resulting in network traffic spikes, especially when groups of maps finish. So Amazon CloudWatch will also show you how much output, how much data the output network is sending. Okay? So here I'm showing you the map machine's network output plot over time. Here's where the blocking job starts. Here's where the pipelining job starts. And we see 3 spikes in the blocking case. The first spike corresponds to the first 2 maps finishing. Second spike is the 3rd map finishing and sending its output, of course. And then here's the last spike is the last map finishing. As you can see over here, we don't have those dramatic spikes in the pipeline case. So a more realistic setup that I'm going to show you here made use of 20 extra large EC2 nodes. These nodes are 4 cores with 15 gigabytes of RAM. We have a slot, we configure the slot capacity to be 80 maps and 60 reduces. Now that's 4 maps and 3 reduces per machine. We evaluated using a word count job on 100 gigabytes of randomly generated words. So randomly generated, what should you think, combined or not effective? The block size, we used 2 different block sizes. The first block size that we used was 512 megabytes. This resulted in 240 maps. The second block size is 32 megabytes, resulting in 3120 maps. I'll tell you why we did that in a second. And we hard-coded the number of reduces to 60 reduces. Okay, so here I'm showing the same kind of graphs. On the left, you'll see blocking. On the right, you'll see pipelining. This is for the 512 megabyte block case. So this is 240 maps. Maps are scheduled in 3 waves, the first 80, the second 80, the third 80. Large block size creates these reduced idle periods where you have poor CPU I/O overlap. So if you look at the reduced plot here, you'll see these dips in the progress, whereas on the pipelining, it's more steep in the shuffle phase. But again, in the pipelining, you still have this little dip here at the top at 75% where it has to do that final sort. So it's doing extra sorting work. So for this, we have 49 minutes and 36 minutes, respectively. My last performance slide here. We submitted this paper, by the way, to NSDI, and Jeff Dean was our shepherd. And he asked, well, can't you get pipelining by just reducing the block size? And indeed, this is true. So we reduced the block, but to a certain extent. We reduced the block size to 32 megabytes, which gave us 3120 maps, which resulted in 39 waves. So it's kind of like pipelining, right? You get better CPU-I overlap, for sure. But it increases the scheduling overhead. So we don't think that this is a scalable solution. Our adaptive policy, we believe, finds the right degree of parallelism based on runtime dynamics like load and network capacity. So here we have 42 minutes in the runtime. Here in the pipeline, decreased by a minute, but not by much. However, the reduced line is much smoother. So future work. Yeah, let me just finish future work and then I'll get to that question. So blocking versus pipelining performance study. What I've shown you here is by far not a thorough performance study. Okay, we ran 1 job at a time. That's just completely unrealistic, and I admit that. What we wanted to do is we wanted to tease out the characteristics of blocking versus pipelining so that we could build or work toward a Hadoop optimizer. Online aggregation and stream processing, these are 2 new features that we've enabled that require pipelining. What we'd like to do in the future is we'd like to make statistically robust estimations, random sampling of the input so that we don't punt the user to figure out the right distribution of things, and a better UI for approximate results. For stream processing, we want to develop a full-fledged stream processing framework, and we want to support stream processing in higher level languages like Pig and Hive. And with that, I'll conclude. Like I said, our paper is in NSDI this year. The source code is on Google Code, and there's my contact. Thank you.
We've been talking about pipeline between maps and reduces. Can you considered pipeline the initial data into the maps from our side, not from HDFS?
So there is a project called Hadoop Streaming.
Repeat the question, please.
Yeah, so the question was, is have we considered streaming from outside of a map, so the input to a job, the input to a map. We consider streaming in that case. And there's actually already a project out there called Hadoop Streaming that does this.
So in your results, right, almost I think all of the time you have enough reducers that pipelining always happens. Do you have any sense of what would happen if I don't have enough reduce lots? Will performance fall off quickly, or is there a gradual fall off?
So if you don't have reduces, if you don't have the slot capacity for pipelining on reduces, what will happen is that those outputs are not going to be able to get sent. Right? And what happens in that case is that we'll end up merging at the mappers. We'll merge that portion of the output, so that when the reduces come back online, at least we're sending, at least we're performing as well as the block interface.
Yeah.
Last question, we'll...
So can you go back to the performance slides?
We have time?
Yeah, actually the question is, for the first case, for the normal MapReduce, is it like most of the reducers actually finish a long time before, while we have one or two reducers are waiting? Because when I look at the graph, it seems like the last portion takes a long time. It's kind of a long tail.
Yeah, that's because we've made the shuffle phase 75%, I believe, in regular Hadoop is broken up into thirds. So that last 25% is the reduced phase, which makes it look a lot longer when in fact it's about what you would see in regular Hadoop.